Today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 1, and it's called Spain's Empire in the Americas. Throughout the 1500s and 1600s, the Spanish conquered Central America as well as portions of North America, building a large overseas empire, making this country extremely powerful. And this is going to lead to several conflicts that we'll be getting into leading up to the start of United States history. But right now we are still in really American history, just talking about the New World. So the United States does not yet exist. It is really a collection of territories being fought over by larger colonial powers, and poor Native Americans are caught up in the mix. Because you see, our first term here is conquistador. A conquistador is a Spanish word for conqueror. And one of the most famous of these conquistadors was Hernando Cortez, who landed on the beaches of Veracruz in what is today Mexico. And upon landing on the shores, according to his chronicler Bernal Diaz, you can actually read a first-hand account of these adventures. It's amazing. Cortez landed on the beaches, and then he turned to his men, and he ordered his ships to be set on fire. And he addressed his mere army of 600 soldiers. And he said, "Men, on these shores we will either find glory and riches, or we will meet our doom. But we will not turn back." And so he burned the ships. I think it's a neat gesture. What's even neater is that he pulled it off and survived. You see, he had 600 men. And Cortez wound up conquering an army of hundreds of thousands of Aztec warriors. Now, how on earth? Right? It's one of those stories I read, and then I read again, and then I was like, wait a second. Somebody made this up. Hang on. It was, what, how? Well, to be fair, it wasn't just 600 soldiers. As he was leading his army into the Aztec Empire, he found something, and I'll get to it in just a moment. But first off, why? Why would he do this? And just like we've been investigating, why did these colonists come to the New World? Why would they explore? Well, gold, of course, the possibility of great wealth, and glory, because many of us know Cortez's name. In some ways, he was wanting to carve his name in history. And then finally, God, like all these others, he was bringing with him across the planet. And so I wanted to come back to that. With 600 men, Cortez landed on these beaches, setting fire to his own ships, removing the possibility of escape. How did he conquer the most powerful empire in the Americas at this time? Well, first off, the Aztecs were hated. Does anybody know why the Aztecs might have been hated? The Aztecs were known for human sacrifice. They believed in a very violent set of gods that demanded sacrifice. And they were very superstitious people. You see, they believed that unless their god, Quetzalcoatl, tasted the blood of humans, he would not bring the sun out for their crops. Well, the Aztecs were a powerful people. And those that they had conquered, they demanded tributes from each of the provinces that they ruled. Well, that doesn't make for a very popular empire. So when Cortez landed, and when the surrounding natives saw that he was a force to be reckoned with, they began to join his cause. And so Cortez was not alone, though he only had 600 soldiers. The last ruler of the Aztecs was named Montezuma, which, if you're familiar with Mexico, Montezuma's revenge is what? Anybody ever heard that phrase? Yeah.
He cursed like the water or something like that. I don't know, like something.
Yeah, so in Mexico, what are you not supposed to drink?
Their water.
Right, the tap water. It's unsafe. It can give you some pretty nasty gastrointestinal funkiness and make you sick for weeks. It's called Montezuma's Revenge because the last emperor of the Aztec Empire was named Montezuma. And he was also a rather superstitious person. And when he heard that this mysterious people had come from the sea, wearing this shining armor, riding on these mythical beasts. Remember, they had never seen horses before. By the way, I'm excited about your commercials, so we'll get to that. But they'd never seen a horse. And here his armies are riding horses using gunpowder. They'd never seen gunpowder weapons, using steel armor. So, I mean, these guys could have been aliens to them, for all he knew. So Montezuma, pretty scared of what all he's seen, invited Cortez to his palace. Invited his men to come live as honored guests. And they did for quite some time. And then finally, within the empire, Cortez managed to overthrow the powerful Aztecs.
The religion.
And eventually Cortez fell out of favor with Montezuma, and they tried to oust the Spanish. And it was really too late by that point. He had already kind of embedded himself in the culture, but at one time they tried to run him out of the city. And his chronicler, Bernal Diaz, writes about this. And the book's called The Conquest of New Mexico, or New Spain, excuse me, what they were calling it at the time. And he writes of these people trying to escape as the natives were sacrificing their people in front of them. Well, another part that was playing against the natives was their style of warfare. Because they relied on human sacrifice, they would often try to capture people in war instead of just killing them outright. And so it's a terrifying thing to witness, but ineffective strategically. But nonetheless, Cortez and his men conquered the most powerful empire in Central America.
In 1519, the ambitious and ruthless Hernán Cortés led an unauthorized expedition into the heart of Mexico. Hearing of great riches that lay waiting in the Aztec Empire, Cortés led 600 armed soldiers from Cuba into the center of Mexico to the largest city in the Americas, Tenochtitlan.
Tenochtitlan was the largest city in the Americas, and it dazzled the Spanish when they first saw it during the 15 teens. They had never seen a city that large or that rich. Not back in Europe. They had not, at least not in Spain.
The Aztec stone pyramid temples dazzled the Spaniards, but their practice of human sacrifice repulsed them. The Spanish harshly judged others based on their religious beliefs.
In the places in the New World where the Spanish come in contact with Native Americans, they're pretty much also, unlike the French, contemptuous of Native American religion. And I think this can be seen quite clearly in Mexico, where they are just appalled by the religion of the Aztecs, with its human sacrifice, with its idols, and with its whole cosmological and religious belief system.
They practice human sacrifice on quite a large scale in order to appease their gods, especially their god of war and god of rain. So the Spanish felt fully justified when they became familiar with Aztec beliefs in violently conquering and subduing the Aztec and suppressing their beliefs. They thought that they were doing a good thing by their Christian God to accomplish these goals.
Cortés' troops reduced Tenochtitlan to rubble. They killed many of the city's inhabitants and overthrew their leader, Moctezuma. The destruction of the Aztec Empire was one of many such tragedies. During the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro sacked the Inca Empire in Peru. His brutality was equal to that of Cortés. During the 1540s, the Mayan people of Central America were also overpowered. Indians who weren't killed were forced to serve the Spaniards. Victorious commanders demanded to be paid an annual tribute called an encomienda. Those who had the right to collect an encomienda were called adelantados.
all of the conquistadors who went into the New World, Pizarro, Cortez, Coronado, de Soto, Menendez, they were all adelantados.
These adelantados were ambitious men of means who received a license from their government to organize expeditions of exploration and conquest in the New World.
And so an adelantado, this is a Spanish term, an adelantado was somebody who received a license from the Spanish king to go out into the world, into a designated zone, and to make conquests, and then to receive plunder and tribute where they succeeded.
Those adelantados who were successful became very wealthy.
And so, for example, in Mexico, Cortez obtained a right called encomienda over all of the villages of the fabulously fertile valley known as Oaxaca. And it is on the basis of the tribute that he would receive, tribute paid in the form of agricultural produce, cloth, and also in labor, that enriched Cortez and made him the wealthiest man in the Americas.
The Spanish missionaries made similar demands, that the Indians give up their native beliefs and culture and surrender to the religion of their conquerors. Most Indians, to keep peace, pretended to adopt Catholicism, but secretly kept their original beliefs.
Let's see. So, let's just assume that the rest of the conquistadors go on to conquer South America, Central America, and even parts of North America. And so now we have to understand, after this has occurred, what comes next. And this is also what we're writing our essay about, the encomienda system. You see, the Spanish settlers were mostly men. You know, adventurous soldiers, settlers, or people hoping to start plantations. These men, these Spanish settlers, were called peninsulares. And they would commonly marry the native women. Now, Spain's goal here was to establish colonies in the New World. And the purpose of these colonies was to exploit the resources of these regions, but also to gain converts to Catholicism. You know, Mexico's dominant religion, Catholicism. South America's dominant religion, Catholicism. And so Spain brought with their soldiers priests to convert the people. But from these peninsulares, we get a new ethnic group, mestizos. And this ethnic group would comprise of people who have ancestry from both Spanish ancestors as well as Native American ancestors. And I would bet many people in this room could perhaps identify with this mestizo ethnic group. Because, again, when the settlers came in, part of cultural blending means intermarrying and intermingling. Well, the topic of your essay this time around is the encomienda system. The system of using the Native Americans as slaves. And these natives were forced to work on these plantations, to farm, to work in mines, to work with domesticated animals, to establish large plantations for the purposes of profit. Now, many of the local priests objected to this practice because it was rather cruel. Because like we've discussed previously, many of these natives died off from disease. Many of them were treated rather cruelly. And so eventually, King Charles V of Spain outlawed the practice of encomienda. So the system of enslaving Native Americans was abolished. And we have a bit of hypocrisy here. You see, encomienda was abolished, and that's what you're writing your essay about, was the ruling passed down from King Charles. And the question you're answering is, should the settlers have had to obey this law? And though it sounds simple, right? Slavery bad, okay, they don't, whatever. But as you begin to read it, and you begin to see that the abolishment of encomienda actually resulted in the importation of African slaves, well, it's not like we're just ending slavery. No, we're just using another group of people as slaves. And again, another question in this argument is, should colonial settlers have to obey the mother country? And that's a bit of a deeper question. So if you ignore the issue of slavery for a moment and you think about it as a colonial issue, should the colonial settlers have to obey a king who's 10,000 miles away? Again, so yes, slavery bad. We can all agree on that. Terrible, awful, cruel practice resulting in the deaths of millions. But if we think about it not as a slavery issue, but we think about it as a colonial issue, well, then the question becomes more difficult to answer. And so as you're reading your documents, you're reading one from Bartolomeu Diaz, a Spanish priest who was living in the Americas, and he writes about the cruelty of encomienda. And he was one of the opponents of encomienda, saying, okay, the natives are dying, like this is awful, this is messed up. But then you're going to read a document from a man named Sepulveda. Sepulveda was one of the plantation owners. Now, he's going to have, obviously, a different opinion of encomienda. He's going to look at it from a cold business standpoint.
After the fall of Tenochtitlan, Cortés began to transform the ruined capital into the metropolis called Mexico City. The Spaniards forced the defeated Aztecs to perform the hard labor of building the new European-style city. Cortés ordered them to tear down the temple of Huitzilopochtli and to use its stones to build this enormous church on the same spot. Mexico City became the capital of the huge colony called New Spain. And for the first 3 years of its existence, Cortés served as its governor. During this time, he introduced the encomienda system to Mexico. This system, which regulated land and labor, was already in place in Spain's other New World colonies. Through this arrangement, the most valued Spanish soldiers received huge tracts of land, called encomiendas, as rewards for their service to the king. For example, King Ferdinand's successor, King Charles V, awarded Cortés 25,000 square miles of land in the valley of Oaxaca. Under this system, the native people who lived on the land were required to convert to Christianity and to work without pay for their Spanish overlords for 3 out of every 7 weeks. During the decades that followed, Cortés continued to finance a number of ventures, including a disastrous expedition to Honduras that cost him a great deal and seriously damaged his reputation. He tried in vain to defend his honor, but in 1540, Cortés was stripped of most of his political power, property, and money. After that, the explorer who conquered Mexico sailed back to Spain, never to return. Cortés lived out his days quite simply, but his exploits had radically changed the course of history. He had led the destruction of a great Native American empire and transferred the control of its land and people to the King of Spain. In so doing, Hernán Cortés established a solid base for Spanish exploration and colonization in North America that would last for hundreds of years.
So a few other countries that were conquered. Well, the countries of England, France, and the Netherlands also sponsored voyages into the New World to establish colonies. As I've told you previously, Florida became a Spanish colony. The legends are that Ponce de Leon believed there was a fountain of youth, that the natives in Florida spread rumor of this magical fountain, that if you bathed in its waters, you would live forever. And so this conquistador heard these legends from the native peoples. He explored all of Florida looking for the secret of eternal life, but he never found it. Though he did find a number of beautiful, crystal clear springs. There is a subterranean aquatic network of underground caves in Florida. They're quite amazing. I've been to some of them.
Scuba truck.
I've never dove into these caves. I don't have the equipment or experience for that. It's very dangerous. But you can snorkel in these springs and you can see hundreds of feet below the surface. It's crystal clear waters and cold and refreshing in a hot place. So I can assume that these places were what the legend spoke of. Because when you jump into these cold waters and it's 100 degrees outside and humidity that sticks onto you, it's refreshing. Makes you feel young again. Although a true fountain of youth was never found, Ponce de Leon established a Spanish colony there. But also in the Southwest, there are legends all throughout the Southeast of the journeys of De Soto, traveling through this area, the Spanish explorer who made some of the earliest maps of these parts of the country. But in the southwestern United States, Coronado led an expedition, establishing Spanish colonies and missions in what are today Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And it would be from some of these same missions, such as the Alamo, that eventually the Texans would win their freedom. Now, the goal of these conquistadors were to subdue the native peoples, to convert them to Catholicism, and to hopefully exploit them for resources such as gold, silver, crops, etc. But meanwhile, the priests were going about their business of converting these native peoples to Catholicism. And they also hoped to suppress aspects of their culture. Well, we could argue, I think it's pretty well established that human sacrifice is bad. I think we can agree on that point. And things such as human sacrifice, the priests were working to abolish those customs. However, along with obvious parts of their custom that needed to go, there were other aspects of their custom that the priests were trying to abolish. They wanted many natives to settle down and begin farming communities. Well, many of these natives were nomadic by nature and didn't want to give up parts of their culture. The Spaniards also tried to make the natives pay taxes. And many native groups rebelled as a result. And here we see a kind of reformation of the encomienda system, because many Spaniards said, well, if you can't afford to pay your taxes, you could always pay your taxes in the form of labor. And so many native groups began to rebel. One of the prominent rebellions was led by a religious leader of the Pueblos named Pope, who led an uprising in New Mexico in 1680. His people went on to destroy several of these Spanish churches. In fact, executed several Spanish priests and generally forced the Spanish out of their villages. And it would take 14 years for the Spanish to regain control. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 2. And the title of this is An English Settlement at Jamestown. We've been talking about the Spanish colonial settlers for so long. Now it's time to transition to talking about the original 13 English colonies. And North Carolina, of course, is one of those. Well, one of the very first English colonies in the New World was in Virginia at Jamestown. This was the first English settlement in North America, founded in 1607. Now, Jamestown was a business venture. It was part of a joint stock company. That means that investors chose to put money into a colony in the hopes to get profits. That means the colony was not necessarily founded by the British government. It was actually founded by a private corporation. So if you've seen the movie Avatar, this is the real world version of Avatar. What was the purpose of Jamestown? To extract resources and gain profits for the company. Now, just like Avatar, the Jamestown colony was not going so well, for many reasons that we'll be exploring. Well, the company that founded Jamestown was called the Virginia Company. And the first 150 settlers arrived in 1607 to found this new English colony called Jamestown. It was located in what is today Virginia, on a small peninsula of the James River. Of these 150 settlers, there were soldiers, there were adventurers, and there were even indentured servants, as well as workers. It was mostly men. And they were all going there to stay permanently. Now, these colonists were going to seek adventure, hopefully get rich, because the rumors of these lands filled with gold and treasures, the city of El Dorado was an old legend of a city in the mysterious colony of the New World filled with gold. Or the legends of the Fountain of Youth in Ponce de Leon, or these legends of an untapped wilderness ripe for the taking. And so colonists were willing to leave everything behind. In some cases, these people were unwilling. Of course, slaves were brought to the New World. Laborers were brought. In some cases, they would go by and take everyone from the jails and move them to this colony. The continent of Australia was settled as a prisoners' colony. Britain decided they had too many prisoners. Their jails were full, so they said, hey, let's send them all to Australia. And that became the country of Australia. True story.
And then also Georgia, right?
Yeah, Georgia was a debtor's colony. We'll get to that in a little bit. But of these people who went to Jamestown, of the excitement and the adventure and the possibilities, most of them died from a million different things. Number one, it goes both ways. That Europeans were coming to the New World. They had not been exposed to many of the diseases here. In some cases, people starved to death. The colony of Jamestown was not very successful at first. And the only thing that kept this colony going was that once or twice a year, ships would arrive and bring new colonists and supplies. And they would bring, kegs and stores of food and more colonists and more seed to get farms started. So the investors were losing money on this venture because it wasn't going so well. Well, the leader of Jamestown was named John Smith. I'm sure you've seen some movies about him, Pocahontas, and there have been several different movies made about this story. Well, John Smith believed that he could make Jamestown successful. But number one, the people were going to have to start farming. They were going to have to spend most of their time making this colony sustainable. And so he actually imposed a system of forced labor. If all colonists were going to have to spend X amount of hours per day farming to make Jamestown work. Also, to make Jamestown work, the people in the colony were going to have to make friends with the native inhabitants, because Jamestown was going to need the help of the local natives, which were called the Powhatan people. And during the winter of 1609, Jamestown went through a very dark period. It was known as the Starving Time. The farms were not producing enough food to feed their people. 600 new colonists arrived on top of that, and so now they have to feed even more people. And on top of that, the goal of making friends with the natives was not going so well. And due to various clashes between the colonists and the natives, and the colonists thinking they could do whatever they wanted to the natives, the Powhatan would frequently raid the village of Jamestown, destroying their farms and contributing to this starving time. So when Jamestown made it through the starving time, as I said, new arrivals and more ships filled with supplies continued to come in. And though crops weren't growing extremely well, eventually farming operations were becoming more successful. But in regards to profits, Jamestown wasn't doing so well, because they were barely growing enough crops to survive and were not producing anything else of value at that time. But then, tobacco was discovered to be an enormously profitable crop that could grow in these tidewaters. And you see, Jamestown, Virginia is part of what we call a tidewater geography, meaning that these low-lying lands are often flooded and often filled with water. And many commercial crops don't grow so well in waters like that. Corn will drown. It just doesn't grow. Rots in the soil. Tomatoes will drown. Again, they literally rot, like the fruit falls off and dies and is no good. Okra, squash, potatoes, all of these things just fail in these tidewater types of climates. However, there are some types of crops that do quite well. Rice, oh my gosh, rice thrives in this type of environment. Tobacco thrives in this type of environment. And tobacco, of course, enormously profitable for a million different reasons. Tobacco became so profitable it was known as brown gold. And it became the number one cash crop of Jamestown. In fact, by the 1620s, just a little over 10 years after the starving time, 1.5 million pounds per year of tobacco were being exported back to England. Now, Jamestown was becoming successful by the 1620s. And there was a system to encourage settlers to come to Jamestown. Because rumors did get back of how desperate and dark and despairing of a place this was, and how you were likely to die of numerous diseases or starvation or axed in the head by Indians or a million different things. But the headright system encouraged settlers to go to the New World, because all you had to do was buy a ticket to get there, and you got a free 50-acre plot of land. A free 50-acre plot of land. Guys, that cost in the ballpark of $100,000 today. So, I mean, more than that, really. 50 acres is a lot of land, especially if it's good farming land. So, if you buy a ticket to get over there, you get a free, large farming plot of land. Now, that's pretty tempting to someone who doesn't have very much money. And so many people were coming over even without the money. They were coming over as indentured servants. Now, an indentured servant is someone who, hoping to take advantage of this head-right system, wants to get to the New World. But maybe they don't have any money. They don't even have money to buy the passage to get over here. And so what they would do is they would contract with a plantation owner in Jamestown who would sponsor their passage to the New World. And in exchange, they would work either 4 to 7 years, depending on the cost of their travel and the arrangement they reach with the landowner. And they would work for free, and at the end of that 4 or 7 years, they would get their own 50 acres. And I would assume that if you have folks that go back to this time period, they maybe came as indentured servants.
By 1616, the Virginia Company had transported more than 1,700 people to the Chesapeake and spent well over 50,000 pounds doing it, an immense amount of money for that century. Yet all they had to show for it was an unprofitable town inhabited by 350 diseased colonists. To stimulate immigration by propertied men, the company also introduced a concept called the head-right system.
So the idea of the head-right system was that for every servant you brought over or whose way you paid, you got 50 acres in Virginia. And servants also, because servants were said to be adventurers in person, you could be an adventurer in purse or in person, and a servant was an adventurer in person because he adventured or she adventured him or herself. They also were promised in the early years land when their term of servitude was up. And that was a lure that was beyond imagining, because none of those people would ever have become landowners in England.
As private property owners, rather than company employees, the colonists showed more initiative to grow their own crops.
And so after about a decade, they begin to hit on the right answer. And the answer that they hit on is the one that Sir Walter Raleigh actually had already come up with. So they do several things at the end of between 1618 and 1620. And what it all boils down to is that they realize that the way to get people to function is to allow them essentially to work for themselves. So they set up a system whereby property ownership becomes widespread. They give people an assembly. Purpose of the assembly is basically to decide on taxation for road building and fortifications and that kind of thing. And they remove the professional military men and put a citizen militia in its place. And it turns out that once you start doing those three things, colonies tend to work.
Secondly, in 1616, led by John Rolfe, the planters began to learn how to raise tobacco. King James at first made this statement about smoking.
It is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs.
How right he was, but he soon learned to love the money England earned from tobacco. In 1638, 3 million pounds of tobacco was shipped from Virginia to England.
Tobacco was Virginia's gold. But once they began to plant tobacco, which coincided with the campaign to bring over large numbers of settlers, then actually Virginia became a thriving colony.
As tobacco plantations grew, the planters needed more land that came to them at the expense of the Indians' need for land. Having lost almost all their land, the Indians were confined on small reservations surrounded by colonial settlements. Disease and war reduced the Algonquin population from 24,000 in 1607, when the settlers arrived, to only 2,000 by 1669. The reduced Indian danger, the increased supply of farmland, and the profits of tobacco cultivation combined to attract growing thousands of immigrants from England. Emigration from England to Virginia more than doubled by the 1660s.
Now, the first Africans would arrive in North America in 1619. And these earliest Africans were treated as indentured servants, meaning that they would work for a period of time to pay for their passage and then they would be set free. However, by the late 1600s, plantation owners began to import slaves. Several reasons. Fewer indentured servants were coming in, and so this cheap source of labor was becoming less readily available. And as the colonies were becoming more wealthy, tobacco was a really stable cash crop. It was in high demand in England, and it could be easily grown in the colony of Jamestown. And so those landowners who had set up these large plantations were doing well for themselves and were able to afford importing slaves into the New World. Now, meanwhile, the English settlers did not intermarry with Native Americans. They did not live with Native Americans. They did not mix with the natives. And there were often hostilities and conflicts between the natives and the settlers, between the Powhatan, even after the starving time. The settlers did not get along with the Powhatan people because as more people were coming to Jamestown with the promise of the headright system, each person who came over expected 50 acres of land to be given to them. And as the population of Jamestown increased, they continued to gobble up more and more land until, like the video, you saw that the natives were being pushed off of their own land to make way for these colonists. And this was a recipe for conflict. Now, in 1614, Pocahontas, a princess of the Powhatan people, married John Rolfe, the Jamestown plantation owner who had taught the people there how to grow tobacco. And this created a temporary peace. Now again, unlike the Disney movie, this was more of a political marriage, arranged between the chief of the Powhatan people and the leader of Jamestown, who saw a marriage as an opportunity to create peace and end the years of conflict that had been going on between the Powhatan peoples and the peoples of Jamestown. Even with this political marriage, violence continued because the population of Jamestown was growing, and with the headright system, the colonists continued to expect plots of land. It was only fair, that's why they came here. Yet, this land was encroaching on the Powhatan people's home. And because of that, conflict continued until finally this joint stock venture, led by a private corporation, was taken over by the king, and Virginia became a royal colony under direct control of the King of England. Now, just like hostilities between the natives and the colonists, hostilities eventually develop between many of the former indentured people, the poor living in Jamestown, and the wealthy. You see, these former indentured servants often were given land on the frontier. So they would be given land far out of the city limits and simply told to settle and develop that land. Well, often this land belonged to Native American tribes, making their lives rather dangerous. Now, these indentured servants were not allowed to vote in their assemblies, so they had no say over what taxes would be levied on them. And since they had no say in their government, often they would be the ones forced to pay high taxes. Now, as I said, the frontier settlers these former indentured servants who would be told, oh, by the way, your plot of land is way over there. And just so you know, there's a local tribe that thinks that's their land. Good luck with that. Yeah. Enjoy. I would build a big fence if I were you. And the Powhatans would frequently attack these frontier settlements, frequently killing their livestock. Now, another problem, not all settlers wanted to be farmers, and not all settlers were engaged in occupations that would benefit the whole colony. Many settlers were more interested in finding these legendary golden cities. And so they began to explore further and further out. And again, began to try to encroach on lands that belonged to others. The wealthier people in Jamestown were these plantation owners who could afford to live right within the city and have others work their farms. And as the frontier settlers began to complain to the local government in Jamestown about the natives attacking their settlements, and you see, the natives weren't necessarily murderers. They would attack and they would raid and they would tear up their farms as a warning. They weren't always just going in and killing everybody and knifing women and children, and like the rumors would suggest. Often they would just try to send a message. Maybe set their crops on fire. A harsh message, yes. But the point was to try to tell them this is not your land. You need to go home. And the governor of Jamestown refused to provide resources to help the frontiersmen fight these natives. So, another great movie you should watch on this subject is Last of the Mohicans. It's set a little further, and we'll get to that topic in a few days. But it does deal with this issue of frontiersmen who are often under attack from a tribe of people known as the Mohawks. And that movie was actually filmed right here in Henderson County. In fact, the neat part at the end of the movie where the bad guy's fighting the good guy, and that was filmed at Chimney Rock. And so there's this part of the movie where people are falling off of Chimney Rock. So you totally got to watch it. It's pretty amazing. Now, Nathaniel Bacon, I know, don't we all love that name, right? Raised an army to fight these natives on the frontier. Now, you see, what makes Bacon's rebellion interesting, aside from the fact that, Bacon, we all love it, but what makes it interesting is that Nathaniel Bacon was one of these frontier settlers. He was just a man living in the middle of nowhere. He felt threatened from attacks by these natives. And so he called a meeting, not of the government in Jamestown. He called a meeting of other frontier settlers. And he said, it's time we defend our land. The government's not going to do it. Jamestown doesn't care about us. The king doesn't care about us. It's time we take matters into our own hands and stand up for our homes and family. And it was called Bacon's Rebellion because he wasn't a part of the government of Jamestown. He didn't have any authorization to do this. He did it entirely on his own. And in fact, the governor of Virginia called his army illegal. They said, you're not supposed to do that. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? We're getting attacked. What am I supposed to do? Am I allowed to, may I defend myself and my family now? Well, the governor said, no, you don't have the right to do that. So what did Bacon do? Well, Bacon, I just love getting to use that name, right? Anyway, Bacon takes matters into his own hands and sets fire to the colony of Jamestown. So they told him, no, you can't defend your own family. And I don't think that went over too well.
That's right.
I can just imagine, right? Bacon stood up for itself. It's the only time you'll hear this story. And not only did bacon stand up for itself, but it went and set fire to the capital of Virginia.
Mr. Witt. Mr. Witt, I can't.
All right, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 3, and the title of it is Puritan New England. The English Puritans came to the Americas beginning in the 1620s. So from the early days of the English settlement in what is today the original 13 colonies of the United States, we have Puritans coming here. And they're an interesting group of people worth studying because a large number of our earliest immigrants were from this group. So who were they? Well, Puritans are a religious group. They were originally part of the Church of England, but they hoped to purify the church or reform it from within, hence the name Puritan. And the Church of England resented this attempt at reformation and ousted them. So eventually many Puritans wound up coming here. Another important group of pilgrims coming here were separatists. And separatists were those who felt that the English church was too corrupt to reform and removed themselves from it for religious reasons. And so these two groups of people, fleeing England to escape persecution, founded Plymouth Colony in New England. And so they came here for religious reasons. And it was some of these early pilgrims or religious travelers who emphasized the idea of a separation of church and state because they saw the corruption that stemmed from a too close connection between religion and government. And then we have the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1630, a joint stock company, which we should know what that is, again, a private venture, founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a Puritan colony, meaning that these were Christians coming over to escape religious persecution because of their unique ideas about Christianity that conflicted with the Anglican Church. The first governor of this colony was John Winthrop, who was a Puritan himself. And so these people aimed to found a community where they could practice their unique brand of Christianity in peace.
In September of 1620, 35 saints and 67 strangers set sail from the port of Plymouth on the coast of England. Their goal, to establish a second permanent English colony in North America.
These were people
primarily defined by their religious identity. They were Puritans,
which was a term
that meant that they were trying to purify the Protestant religion.
They felt that it had not
sufficiently broken with Catholic precedent.
There were too many ceremonies
and
too much of the church
hierarchy that had been carried over from Catholicism.
They were increasingly in conflict with the king and with the
upper hierarchy of the church, the bishops and the archbishops,
didn't think that
the church should make any more changes,
that it had reached just the right
level of reformation. And they then proceeded to try to purge the church of these Puritan elements.
The group had been granted permission to settle in northern Virginia, but when they arrived at Cape Cod instead, outside London Company territory, they draw up a document to legitimize their position before they leave the ship.
We whose names are
the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in ye presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, and by virtue hereof to enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good, of ye colony, to which we promise all due submission and obedience.
It isn't long before
other Puritans decide to risk the voyage.
Especially
After the mid-1620s, when there was a new king, King Charles I,
and some new
and some new archbishops who were hardliners about trying to suppress Puritanism. Many Puritans in England thought that they needed to get out.
The people who embark on these journeys are quite different from those who signed on for passage to the Chesapeake.
People have in fact analyzed the ship lists.
And we know a lot
about the early settlement patterns, what towns they went to, what patch of land they lived on, and so on,
and who they brought
with them. Because colonial New Englanders were nothing if not
lots and lots of records.
Lots and lots of records.
The dominant
migration would have been families
with parents in their late
20s, 30s, even early 40s.
Of some substance and maturity.
There were people who owned some property, who owned their own farm or their own shop back in England. So we have much more of an age spectrum. Children to young adults to even old people who are going together as intact family groups. They're going with some property of their own. They're paying their own way. Some people crossed because they were drawn by the prospect of cheap or free land. Some people were drawn by a spirit of adventure. Some people were disappointed and went back. But the majority of New Englanders were sort of self-selecting Puritans who wanted to establish a godly community in the New World, the kind of community that they had tried and failed to establish in the Old World. People often say that the Puritans came to England because they were being persecuted in Old England. There's an element of truth to that, but many people in England might have said that the Puritans left because they had tried and failed to persecute everybody else in England, and that they now want to persecute others in North America.
If you looked at that, you would find large numbers of people who came
with a congregation.
Maybe not everybody in the congregation,
but a big subset of a church in England would travel together, and would settle.
And that's one reason all you have to do is
look at the place names.
Compare them to Old England
to see a lot of that kind of continuity.
And then of course there's the word of mouth. Writing back. People who are in effect
kind of advanced scouts.
We're here. It looks good.
You should come over.
There are people who write and say, I have never been so miserable in my whole life, and I wish I could come home.
As an Englishman studying early American history, I think it's very important to recognize that when people crossed the Atlantic, they didn't dump all their cultural baggage overboard. They were very much Englishmen and Englishwomen living in a new world. And that new world transformed their lives in many respects, but they still, in many other respects, remained a product of the culture they had come from. So it's important for us to understand the culture they came from and the way in which the various attitudes and structures that they brought with them gradually, but only gradually, transformed and adapted in these very different circumstances. But rather than thinking of the colonists as Americans, it's in some ways more helpful and perhaps more revealing to think about the interaction between their identity as English men and women and their experiences in this very different environment, which then remade, reconstituted their Englishness, their Europeanness in very fascinating ways.
Now, the Puritan people who came here were devoutly religious in a way that may be difficult to relate to. Entire churches would uproot from England, board a ship, travel together, and settle a new community together, and die together and have their babies and all the sort. You know, it's an interesting culture. And you saw aspects of their dress from the recreations in the video. Extreme modesty, extreme devoutness. In fact, many of these Puritans came here purely for religious reasons, for establishing some type of religious utopia or religious community. And they, many in their writings, even called this the city upon a hill, the New Jerusalem, if you will. They felt this manifest destiny that God had given them this land to dwell on. Well, in the Puritan communities, only adult men were allowed to vote. The basic structure was a judicial system called a general court and an executive branch called a governor. And these would be chosen by the adult males in the community. The government and the church were intertwined in these Puritan communities. That means there was no separation of church and state in these early Puritan settlements, and we'll see what happened as a result of that soon. But the government officials, the governor and the general court, were also members of the church. In fact, they had to be members of the church to be members of this government. And they felt they had a duty to do God's will. Now, as I said, the Puritans generally came here as whole family groups. Grandpa, grandma, mom, dad, kids, parents, ministers, neighbors, other church members all coming together. Among the Puritan communities, the people in these communities felt they had a responsibility to each other to make sure that each of them adhered to the strict principles of Puritan teachings. Meaning that it was the community's responsibility to rebuke those who are in sin. It's the community's responsibility to provide a structure of consequences for those who do wrong, and to make sure they behave in a, quote, God-fearing way.
That is, of course, a matter of some ongoing discussion and debate. People have generally talked about it in regional terms because the groups that come are very much differentiated by the region in England from which they come, the American colonies to which they come, and the motives that animated them, as well as the social profile of the group, does vary significantly.
For example, the fact that some of the colonists had encountered Irish resistance to colonization during the latter half of the 16th century influences their attitude toward Native Americans.
They saw the Irish as a very barbaric people who needed to be settled and civilized, and they were disconcerted by the unwillingness of many of the Irish to go along with this. And they certainly came to North America with a very lively sense of the dangers, the challenges of settling a land in which there was already a group of people living who were allegedly savage and certainly culturally very different and disconcertingly uncooperative at times. The initial experiences of explorers in North America resulted in two very different sets of expectations. On the one hand, Native Americans seemed to be very friendly and cooperative and generous-spirited. On the other hand, they seemed to be, from a European perspective, horrifyingly different, which for them meant inferior and savage. And there was a tremendous ambivalence on the part of the early colonists whether to perceive the Native Americans in positive, constructive terms or as a threatening, dangerous obstacle. The fact that the colonists are at first very weak and need Native American cooperation, of course, encourages them to interact with them somewhat constructively.
In the midst of the political and social turmoil that characterizes the reign of Charles I, Puritan merchants obtained a grant of land and a charter from the king to create the Massachusetts Bay Company.
They discover that unlike other corporate charters, there is no residency clause in the Massachusetts Bay Company. It doesn't say the Massachusetts Bay Company of London, Virginia Company, the Virginia Company of London. It doesn't say anything like that. And so what they do is take the charter along to America with them, and over the course of a little more than 10 years, they convert it into a functioning constitution for the colony itself. So it's really not a money-making operation in itself, the way the Virginia Company is supposed to be. It really is a structure for a colony.
Massachusetts Bay was economically the most successful, geographically the most expansionist of the New England colonies, was an irritant to the crown. From the very beginning, Massachusetts Bay, and more broadly, had a high sense that local prerogatives, local authority, local privileges were important, so that in New England they saw themselves as recapturing the authority that had been undersold by Charles I.
And so they established the town meeting, what is to become the cornerstone of community life, of local control.
Now, another very interesting colony is the colony of Providence and what today became Rhode Island. This was founded by a man named Roger Williams. He was one of these separatist ministers. He had controversial views that conflicted with the Anglican Church, to the point in which he felt that he and his congregation must leave the Church of England. But he had some controversial views even in the New World. You see, he felt that the English settlers had no rightful claim to the land upon which they dwelt unless they purchased it from the Native Americans. Otherwise, they are committing theft.
Well, that's flawed.
Yeah.
Native Americans don't believe that you can buy land.
Well, and that's a good point. The Native Americans believed that land was more of a communal commodity. But Roger Williams does have an interesting point. That he felt that we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Really? What kind of crazy idea is that? Let me say it again. He felt that we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. What an idiot, right? I don't know. The golden rule doesn't make sense. Okay. I try. Well, what I'm trying to say is he was one of the few leaders of a New World colony that actually sought to treat the Native Americans as decent people. And for this, his ideas were considered extreme. And though you've got a point that the natives viewed land ownership in a much different way, he also taught that the Puritan government had no right to punish settlers for worshiping according to their conscience. And he also distanced himself from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because of this. If you're ever traveling through the Northeast, Rhode Island and Massachusetts are right next to each other. A few miles. It's not that far. And these colonies were close to one another and had some communication. And Roger Williams' concept of freedom of religion was viewed as very controversial. Because yes, the Puritans came here to escape religious persecution, and yes, they came here to establish a religious colony where they could believe according to their conscience. But if you lived in that colony, you better worship the way they did. In fact, we'll talk about witch burning here soon. Yeah, that was a thing. So, there was not really a sense of religious toleration in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But yet, Providence, Rhode Island practiced tolerance towards the Native American peoples and freedom of religion. So tolerance of different peoples and, Carly, freedom of religion. These are very important concepts. Concepts that we consider to be fundamental to the American way of life, yet they were viewed as extreme at the time. In fact, I want you to consider this. For daring to have those two main beliefs of freedom of religion and tolerance toward the native peoples, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony ordered Roger Williams to be arrested, to be arrested for daring to teach that if you want to believe what you want to believe, that's your right to do so. For daring to teach that you should treat the native peoples as you would want to be treated. This was considered a crime in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so he was ordered to be arrested. And he fled the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he founded his own colony at Providence, Rhode Island. And it's a very interesting place. You can go, Providence is still a town. You can go visit. It's very beautiful. This new colony adhered to these ideas of Roger Williams and peacefully negotiated with the local tribes for a parcel of land upon which they could settle. They came to a mutual agreement. And in this community, there would be, by law, a separation of church and state and religious freedom. Pretty neat stuff. Another neat story within the Puritan community is Anne Hutchinson. And I think several neat things about her story. Number one, she's a woman. And she is a preacher or a minister. During a time, well, there are even still churches today that preach that women cannot be ministers. But especially in the time of the Puritans, it was believed to be immoral for a woman to even speak publicly or hold any measure of authority over a man. That was considered immoral at this time. And I think in many ways Anne Hutchinson was a hero, if for nothing else in the fact that she was brave enough to get up to express what she believed. And she had a large number of followers. She had the audacity to preach that people have the right to read and interpret scriptures or read and understand religion for themselves. That ministers could help, they could counsel, but it was not the job of ministers to tell people what to believe. Whoa. Wait a second. Now imagine that you're a Puritan in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You wear black head to toe. You wear this big giant hat. The only visible part of your body is your face. Women wear bonnets covering their head at all times. We're essentially the Taliban here, living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Extreme modesty. Extreme fundamentalism. They put people in stocks for public drunkenness. They put people in stocks for, quote, ungodly behavior. And here is a woman who was outspoken and courageous enough to tell people that they had the right to interpret their faith as they chose. And guess what they did to her?
They killed her.
No, we'll burn some witches soon. Hang on, we're not yet burning witches. We'll get there. Yeah, I know. But what do you think happened to her?
They arrested her.
She got banished.
Yeah. They probably, had she stuck around, they probably would have arrested her. Had she really persisted, eventually maybe they would have burned her. I don't know. But her particular story, she was told to leave. She was exiled. She was kicked out of the community. And her family and her followers, her congregants, all left together.
At the very heart of Puritanism is an extraordinary level of subversiveness. Puritanism is a belief that puts tremendous emphasis on the individual's relationship to God, unmediated by a church, by sacraments, by a minister. Nobody is supposed to tell you what to believe. You read the Bible, and you have a relationship with God. This is a tremendously individualistic and empowering and dangerous belief in a lot of ways. And it's a belief that some people took more seriously than the Puritans wanted them to do. Anne Hutchinson took it more seriously.
Mistress Hutchinson, you are called here as one of those that have troubled the peace of the Commonwealth and the churches here. You are known to be a woman that hath had a great share in the promoting and divulging of those opinions that are the cause of this trouble. And you have maintained a meeting and an assembly in your house that hath been condemned by the General Assembly as a thing not tolerable, nor comely in the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex. Therefore we have thought good to send for you, to understand how things are, that if you be in an erroneous way, we may reduce you, that so you may become a profitable member here among us.
I am called here to answer before you, but I can hear no things laid to my charge.
I have told you some already, and more I can tell you.
Name one, sir.
Why do you keep such a meeting at your house, as you do every week upon a set day?
I conceive there lies a clear rule in Titus, that the elder women should instruct the younger, and then I must find a time wherein I must do it. If you convince me there is no rule, then I shall yield.
This rule crosses that in the Corinthians, but you must take it in this sense, that elder women must instruct the younger about their business, and to love their husbands and not to make them clash. I am persuaded that the revelation she brings forth is delusion. Therefore, if it be the mind of the court that Mistress Hutchinson, for the things that appear before us, is unfit for our society, let them hold up their hand. Mistress Hutchinson, the sentence of the court you hear is that you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman not fit for our society, and are to be imprisoned until the court shall send you away.
I desire to know wherefore I am banished.
Say no more. The court knows wherefore, and is satisfied. Come away with you.
Some of the most vociferous and dangerous challenges to Puritanism came not from people who said, we don't believe a word of this. It came precisely from people who said, we believe every word of this, and we take it more seriously than you, the ministers, do. We are relying on our reading of the Bible, and you can't tell us otherwise, because if you do, you're the one who's backsliding. You're the one who's distorting the doctrine. So that's clearly an unintended consequence, and that too opens up challenges to authority that are destabilizing and disconcerting to the people in charge. So part of what the Puritans discovered was that the Catholic Church knew something about keeping people in order.
If you were watching the reenactment of the case, she quoted a verse in Titus which gave women the right, Titus is a book in the New Testament, gave women the right to instruct younger women. And the judge contradicted her with a verse in the Corinthians. And I looked it up. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5 or 7. And it says, women are to remain silent in the churches. If they have a question, they are to ask their husband at home. Now, again, we read that and we're like, whoa, that's hardcore. Well, you know, people of that time interpreted that quite literally. 1 Corinthians 11, either verse 5 or verse 7. And pretty sure it's 1 Corinthians. But double check me on that. But anyway, yeah, we read that and we're like, whoa, messed up. You know, women have the right to be teachers, be doctors, lawyers, and maybe soon even presidents. So, yeah, I mean, the concept of the immorality of women holding authority over men, I think history has debunked that. But at this time, it was considered extreme enough that this woman was ousted from her community for daring to teach others and daring to instruct that people have the right to interpret their faith for themselves. Now, there were a number of disputes over land among these New England colonies. As settlers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony began to spread west from Massachusetts, founding the colonies of New Hampshire and Connecticut, they did so through treaties with the Native Americans. You know, the attempt was to live peacefully with their neighbors. However, there was a fundamental misunderstanding. You see, many of these natives thought that these treaties were temporary and that the land would be granted back to them at a set time. However, the Europeans generally viewed these treaties as permanent. And it does go back to that misunderstanding about land ownership, that the natives thought that they would temporarily dwell on this land, that it was a public commodity, if you will, like camping in the forest. But yet the Europeans viewed it in much more of a business transaction, that to the point where it became theirs. And this led to an actual war. You see, Julissa, one of the tribes to stand up to these New Englanders were the Pequots. And they felt that they had been cheated, that they were being lied to, that instead of a temporary treaty upon which they would dwell there until they found a more permanent place to stay, you know, it's almost like saying, hey, you can crash on my couch. And then suddenly that person starts moving their things in. Starts small, right? So, hey, you can stay on my couch for a little bit. And then you see a lamp. Like, where'd that lamp come from? Oh, that's mine. Yeah, and then, like, why? Where's that laptop? What's that? Oh, that's mine. Huh. Yeah, and then suddenly, okay, why are all these clothes all around? Well, you know, and then posters. And, well, this just, I thought I'd make it like my old room. Well, I said you could crash on my couch. I didn't say you could move in. And I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding. Now, again, you know, what do you do in that situation? Well, eventually, you know, if they persist, you got to run them off. Well, how do you do that? Well, it gets really awkward if it's a friend. But what do you do if it's a group of people who you've invited to temporarily stay on part of your land? You know.
It's like, I'm going to set fire to it and they'll be gone.
Yeah, and then what do? Like, you got to run off a group of people. So you approach them and you say, hey, can you leave? Like, yeah, exactly. Like, it's time, you got to go. And they say, and then they produce that document that says, but you gave us permission. We're staying. And they're like, no, that's not exactly what we meant. Well, what do we do? Well, eventually things are going to get ugly, and that's where the Pequot War came in. The Pequots took a stand against the colonists to attempt to get them to leave, because they had never promised that they could stay permanently. And the colonists actually said, no, we're not going to leave. And so this is the case where you say, okay, guy on the couch, it's time to go. And guy on the couch races up and knocks you down.
No, you're like, you don't pay rent. All right, bye.
Yeah. Not only does he knock you down, but you wind up leaving your own house. That's what happened. Yeah. I know, we have laws and all that, but the point is that it's not pleasant. In fact, on a larger scale, the Puritans were not only staying on land that had not been permanently promised to them, but in many cases they were forcing the natives to do work for them. Oh my gosh, so now the guy on the couch is eating out of my fridge? Come on! Like, it's just not right anymore. The natives were being forced to follow Puritan laws. I mean, now guy on the couch is playing video games when my shows are on. Come on, not even cool.
Bro.
Yeah, not cool. So, they were being forced to follow the Puritan laws. They were being forced to give up their land and to even do work for the English. And so, a chief of the Wampanoag chief named Metacom organized a confederation of tribes. You see, individual tribes had tried to stand up to the colonists, but the colonists typically had advanced technology, guns and cannons, and were able to defeat the tribes. However, this chief attempted to unite a number of different tribes against a common enemy, these English settlers. And the goal was to wipe them out. Enough was enough. They were going to finally rid New England of these unwanted guests. And this was called King Philip's War. The war was characterized by terrible casualties, wanton destruction of not only life but also property and crops, which led often to fierce hunger and disease, and the eventual defeat of the tribes, because it was a colonial victory. And while it was a colonial victory, it was very disastrous for all involved. We could call this a Pyrrhic victory, meaning there was a winner, but really everybody lost. Because 16 colonial villages were entirely destroyed throughout this war. 1/10 of the men among the New England colonies were dead as a result of this war. Now, the Wampanoag casualties were quite severe. In fact, they were nearly wiped out. And this was effectively the end of native power in southeastern New England. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 4. It's called the Settlement of the Middle Colonies. And so we'll be looking at several interesting colonies here, like Pennsylvania, for example. One of my favorite colonies to talk about. Now, let's start with New Netherland. New Netherland was founded by the Dutch. And I just think it's an interesting contrast to talk about New Netherland versus yesterday's lesson on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Because it was founded by the Dutch. And the Dutch had established a large commercial empire called the West India Company. And this corporation had colonized New Netherland, which is today New York. And they invited people from all over. They said, we don't care who you are, what you believe, what you look like. You got 3 arms, you got 4, we don't care. Come on in. Because the purpose of New Netherland was to generate profit. And anybody who's there, who's working, who's generating profit, if you're working on the farms, if you're cutting wood, if you're hunting otters for pelt, awesome. Whatever you're doing, you're benefiting the colony. Come on in. And so Germans, French, Scandinavians, folks from Africa, from other European countries, they were just coming from all over. And guess what? The folks in New Netherland had friendly relations with the natives. Why? Because they weren't there to conquer. They were there to make money. And which is cheaper, business or war? Now, I've watched enough gangster movies to tell you that wars cost money, whether you're talking about nations or gangs or just businesses in general. Like this trade war business, it's expensive. It's much cheaper. It's much more beneficial for everyone if we all get along and we do business. And so that's why the Dutch maintained relatively friendly relations. In general, these settlers were more interested in making money than dominating territory. You know, for example, one of the wealthiest commodities coming out of the New World were furs. Furs were considered a luxury item. They were the iPhones of their day. You know, these hardcore mountaineers would travel for months at a time and not see another human. And they would hunt for beaver and otter. They would trap them, they would skin them, and then they would travel months back to these settlements like New Netherland. And they would trade these beaver and otter pelts. And they would make their way all the way back to Europe, and people would pay top dollar for coats made out of these furs, or for top hats made out of these furs. And once more, that was the must-have luxury item that was coming out of the New World. And so the Dutch were making a killing off of this stuff. Well, the English, well, they're who they are. The British were concerned with having the biggest empire in the whole wide world. And they saw New Netherland as a threat. They were like, look, we feel like we need to have a British flag in your city. The Dutch were like, really? Seriously? We're making money here, guys. I mean, we're not trying to take over anything. But the British, being who they were, they saw these neighbors as a threat. And eventually, the Duke of York became the owner of New Netherland. And of course, he named it New York. And the British got their way, and New York became one of the most popular British colonies. And then he gave part of the land to his friends, other aristocrats, powerful landholders, etc., and they named that part New Jersey.
Did you know that New York City was once called New Amsterdam? And it was ruled by another country, the Netherlands? But the Dutch weren't the only people to control the Big Apple. The English also controlled New York for more than a century. New York became part of the United States in 1776, when the 13 original colonies declared independence from Great Britain. During the 1600s, the Dutch, French, and British empires were competing to claim new territories around the world. New territories meant quicker trade routes, strategic military forts, and more land. In 1609, backed by the Dutch, Henry Hudson explored an area of the New World that would soon be named New Netherland. His stories of fertile soil and abundant wildlife convinced the Dutch to expand their territory to North America. 15 years later, the Dutch West India Company helped 30 families move to what is now known as Manhattan. Here, they established a new colony under the Dutch flag. The first colonists made their money in the extremely profitable fur trade. But lawlessness and lack of leadership threatened to stop the flow of money back to the Netherlands. So, in 1626, the Dutch sent Director General Peter Minuit to New Netherland to lead the troubled colony. His first order of business was to put a stop to the fighting that was affecting the fur trade. In the process, Minuit may have made one of the best real estate deals in history. It is commonly thought that he bought Manhattan Island from the local Native Americans for a very small price. But the Native Americans misunderstood the agreement. They thought it was an agreement to share the land, not to give it up. The purchase led to the establishment of the city of New Amsterdam, at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Dutch colonists began spreading into other areas throughout the region. Some moved to Long Island. Others went north to Fort Orange, which is present-day Albany. New Netherland was slowly expanding. In 1631, Minuit returned to Europe. After his departure, conflict with neighboring English colonists and Native American tribes increased. And the swell of violence, corruption, and chaos threatened Dutch control of the region. Then, Dutch Director General Peter Stuyvesant arrived in 1647. Stuyvesant was the ideal man for the job. He was fearless, strong-willed, and disciplined. No one questioned his toughness. A couple years earlier, his leg had been blown off by a cannonball. He was now left with a peg leg, which only added to his intimidating appearance. He was determined to bring order to New Amsterdam and the region. He regulated the taverns and clamped down on smuggling.
How many that of my soul say,
He also forced residents to attend church every Sunday.
for him in God say la.
He tried to mend relations with the Native Americans by insisting that Indians be paid fairly for their services. It was not a popular policy at the time. Stuyvesant established housing standards, developed a market, and began funding public schools. He once said, "I shall govern you as a father his children." Though many resisted his rigid laws, he was able to do what Minuit couldn't: establish order and create a region both profitable and heavily populated. But the colony's success only made it more tempting to other nations. After 40 years of Dutch rule, the colony fell to the English. When the Duke of York was granted territory in America, including New Netherland, by his brother, King Charles of England, he set out with a small fleet of ships. Without forces to defend the region, General Stuyvesant surrendered to the English without a single shot being fired. In September 1664, New Netherland became New York, named after the Duke of York. The English would rule New York until they were finally pushed out in 1776, when residents declared their independence from England. While the name has changed, you can still see the early Dutch influence throughout New York City. For example, the stockade wall that the Dutch built later became Wall Street. Harlem and Brooklyn are named after towns in the Netherlands. Dutch farms called Boweries became the Bowery. And the Bronx was named after Dutch settler Jonas Bronk. What started out as a colony of 30 Dutch colonists in 1624 has grown into a global icon of over 8 million people. New York City.
Now, one of my favorite colonies to talk about is yet another that practiced peaceful coexistence, maybe to the nth degree, and that was the colony of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, a group of Quakers. Now, the Quakers are a Christian denomination also known as the Society of Friends, and so they wanted to found their own colony. But like the Dutch, they didn't care who lived there. They're the Society of Friends. They're friendly people. And so they allowed whoever wanted to come live and help them. It's like, oh, hey, you're from the Iroquois tribe. Awesome. Let's put you to work. Hey, you're from where? Italy? That's interesting. Come on in. Sure. And so everyone worked together. Everyone cooperated. Oh, hey, it's Tanner. He believes in the flying spaghetti monster. Really? Okay. That's cool. Yay, fly. You got the banner on your house. All right, cool. You know, hey, whatever. We're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. We believe in peaceful toleration. Oh, man, Luke, did you have to kill Jared's dog? That's not cool. Like, that's really, I know his dog was pooping on your yard, but did you have to do that? We're pacifist here. We don't fight. We don't do violent things. We're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. Every adult male no matter who you are or where you came from, got 50 acres of land and got the right to vote. And all decisions affecting the community would be voted on at an assembly where representatives chosen by election would appear and decide. And one of the major tenets of their community was the freedom of religion. Tanner's flying spaghetti monster flag. Well, guys, it's going to stay up. I know that bothers Anna Lee. But you know what? Anna Lee's got to move past that, because flying spaghetti monster flag, that's just important to Tanner. And so that's okay. We're going to live with that because we're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. Now, guess what? Of all the colonists that we've had so far, guess who was the best friends with the natives? The Quakers. Everybody loves the Quakers. I mean, they made my cereal this morning. I love these guys, right? Yeah, the Quaker Oats, still important company. They were very friendly with the natives. Like Rhode Island, the folks of Pennsylvania believed in paying fair value for their land. Trade with the natives was regulated to promote fairness. For example, if the natives had a legal claim to a various piece of land for hunting purposes, and they declared that it was not appropriate for Angel to hunt deer on their land, well, if Angel killed a deer on their land, he's got to pay him a fine. By law, that Iroquois tribesman brought Angel to court. Sorry, he's got a tag on that deer. It obviously came from that piece of land. You knew better than to hunt there. I don't know what they told you up in Massachusetts Bay, where God gave you all the land belonging to everyone in the world, but that's not how we do business here. We're Quakers. So trade was regulated. And there was a court to settle differences, because inevitably Luke's going to kill Jared's dog or vice versa, and those bad things are going to happen. We're not going to assume everybody's perfect. And so there's got to be a court to settle differences. But here's the thing, if you treat people fairly and you treat them with respect and decency, 50 years of no violent conflict. Guys, that's like the world record of nicest colony ever. I'm just telling you, it doesn't get any better than that. It really doesn't.
It is not clear how many settlers are enticed to Pennsylvania by Thomas's description. But for Quaker families, the religious freedom the colony offers is reason enough to come.
Those who came to the middle colonies, the Quakers, came with a very distinct set of values which set them off from the Puritans. Two just mentioned the most important. Their much greater regard for gender equality. Women were welcomed as spreaders of the Quaker faith, where Anne Hutchinson was banished from Boston for deigning to be a preacher.
Quaker women travel as what are called public friends. I suppose our closest synonym for that would be missionaries. To folks like the Puritans, it was absolutely scandalous that women would be allowed to have this measure of public authority. Of course, it didn't stop the Puritans when female Quaker preachers were in the neighborhood from gathering in droves to see the spectacle the same way that they would have gone to see, I suppose, a trained dog or a waxworks. It really did have that sort of fascination for them, but tinged, of course, with a real horror that the Quakers would let women parade themselves around in public in this way and be so assertive.
What made this Middle Atlantic colony so distinctive is the pacifism of the Quaker settlers.
They would not lift a hand violently, and they would not shoulder a gun. Even when attacked, they did not believe in killing. And how it mattered dramatically in the way Indian-white relations proceeded. The Quakers arrived in the middle of a bloodbath. War with Indians to the north, war to the south, war up and down the East Coast, even in New Mexico in 1680. huge revolt of the Pueblo against the Spanish. But in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, no blood was shed for 70 years or more until the Quakers lost control of their own government.
So there's a real interest in Indian culture on the part of the Quakers, and also a real commitment to fairness in dealing with the Indians. Now, this does not last. In fact, as soon as the waves of Scots-Irish immigration and German immigration begin to sweep into Pennsylvania at the beginning of the 18th century, expansion onto the frontier, white land hunger, overwhelms this much more benign past.
Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Quakers, to the nation that is to become as well as to Pennsylvania, is religious toleration.
Today, of course, we take it for granted that religious toleration is a great thing, and that one of the things that the government should do is uphold toleration. Assumptions in the 17th century were very different. Once you get into New England, anywhere but Rhode Island, religious toleration is held to be a terrible idea. Why, if you tolerate all different kinds of religion, you open the door for error, the Puritans would say. And so it's really the business of the state to prosecute religious dissidents, to punish them if they can't be driven out.
To worship God the way that God has commanded. That's really why they're there. And they disagree enough that you get these separate colonies. The Connecticut people say, well, we don't like quite what you're doing in Massachusetts, so they try a variant of it. And New Haven tries the most severe variant of it. And then everybody they really can't get along with, they flush down to Rhode Island.
That you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman.
So, you do have this range of experiments, very different sorts of colonies, and including at least one that was founded mostly for the fur trade. That's New Netherland, which becomes New York.
Now, of course, the practical benefit of encouraging religious toleration for the Quakers is that it makes it very easy to populate your colony if you're willing to take all comers. And so the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the German Lutherans, and a variety of other smaller religious sects are drawn to Pennsylvania.
A lot of people have tried to see in the Middle Colonies the seeds of what America would become. The Middle Colonies were neither fully north nor south, they were the middle ground. The Middle Colonies were the melting pot where there was greater diversity of all kinds, and that this somehow foreshadowed the pluralist society of 20th century United States. And they are also very dynamic economically, and you see a lot of early moves toward what we would later think of as early industrialization. So all these people pouring in meant that the construction trades had to grow. They relied heavily on a lot of immigrant labor, some of them indentured servants who would take up the work in mines and in construction trades. I think the main thing to say about the Middle Colonies would be its diversity in ethnic and economic and religious terms, as well as its dynamism.
Guess what? It also works economically. Like the Dutch, when you focus on business rather than conflict, things will work out for you. But here's where things get complicated. We also know there's a problem with being too nice. There is. If you become the doormat, well, what happens? People walk over you. And unfortunately, George Washington once said the best way to promote the peace is to be prepared for war. And even though it feels weird saying that, sometimes, I have to admit, he's got a point. Because, in Pennsylvania, they said, whoever, come on in. And thousands of German immigrants, my ancestors, started coming into Pennsylvania. And eventually, the Quakers were outnumbered by these other folks who felt far differently. Their religious toleration extended to the German Protestant way of thinking, to say that God's given them the land, everything, and then before you know it, Pennsylvania was just like everything else. Slavery was introduced, and they started fighting the natives. Well, by 1752, there were 13 British colonies in North America. Maryland was founded by a Catholic lord named Baltimore, now Baltimore, Maryland. James Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia. as a debtor's colony, meaning that if you owed tons and tons of money back in England, they would throw you in prison and work until you paid off your debt. And so Manny owes just a ton of money back in England. Sorry, Manny, that's the breaks. Well, he owes all this money. He's sitting in prison, and he hears rumors that there's a place in Georgia that he can go, and that Oglethorpe will pay his way, and his debt will be forgiven. So he goes, hey, that's better than prison, right? And then he gets there and he realizes it's not that much better than prison, because his job is to exist between the Seminole Indians and the wealthy plantations of South Carolina. And his job is to basically get raided first. They're just a buffer. They are literally there so that the natives have to attack them instead of attacking the plantations. So welcome to Georgia, Manny. Here's your rifle. Good luck. Don't get scalped.